He was very still. He showed no sign of movement. The other one I saw, there was a little bit more movement, nothing out of the ordinary, but a little bit more movement. This one, he laid very still. He had his eyes closed the whole time, and that was it.
Discussing the execution of Marcus Wellens, 59 years of age, declared dead just before midnight Tuesday at the Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Prison in Jackson. Now, Missouri and Georgia are just the first states to get back into the prisoner execution business following the botched death injection of a man in Oklahoma in April. The death penalty itself remains a contentious subject, always seemingly a hard line between a yes or no vote. And one group would like the conversation to include not just the crime and punishment, but limited government and fiscal responsibility. Joining us now in MidPoint, the national coordinator of conservatives concerned about the death penalty. Let's welcome in John Rowley. John, thanks so much for joining us. I'm sorry, I'm told I have this wrong. This is Marc Hyden. I apologize. Marc, I had the wrong one on the teleprompter, so I apologize. Welcome in. Thanks for joining us.
Ed, thanks for having me, and I answered many names.
That's quite all right. We'll try to get your name correct. That would be the most important thing here. I apologize for that. We knew this was going to happen sooner or later, right? We knew that eventually the prisons were all going to come back and get back into business, correct?
Yeah, after Clayton Lockett's execution that didn't go as planned, we knew that a lot of states were going to start resuming executions. But the problem that many conservatives, such as myself and my colleagues, are worried about is the execution, the lethal injection protocol is shrouded in secrecy. And there's no reason why it should be a state secret where they're receiving these drugs. We don't even know if they're legal.
Well, let's discuss that then. Why is it a secret? I mean, there have been a lot of people who say that we need to make this a little bit more of a transparency if you are going to continue to conduct executions.
Absolutely. I mean, I think this is a transparency and government issue. This has nothing to do with national security. So your guess is as good as mine as to why they want to keep it a secret from the taxpayers.
Let's talk a little bit about governmental involvement here. I know that that's something that you definitely are speaking about here right now. Let's just start with people who will tell you flat out that we need to stop executions, period. The government doesn't need to be involved. We need to cease this immediately. So how do we try to bring the sides together here?
Well, I think it's really easy to do. For me, it's as easy as giving the death penalty what I call the conservative litmus test. I ask myself 4 questions. Is a policy constitutional? Is it pro-life? Is it fiscally responsible? And is it limited government? Because I think that's what makes a policy conservative. And the death penalty is easily inconsistent with at least 3 of those. It risks killing innocent life, so it's not pro-life. It costs more than life without parole, so it's not fiscally responsible. And I don't think giving an error-prone government the power to kill U.S. citizens, I don't think that's limited government.
But is it not necessary? There are those people who would say that it may not be limited government, but you need a death penalty in this country simply because of the heinous nature of certain crimes.
Well, most of the most heinous crimes do not receive a death sentence with the current system, so I would say no. And then you can look at several studies that show the death penalty does not deter murder. I mean, Texas, they use it more than any other state, but they don't have the lowest murder rates. In fact, they're not even remotely close to the lowest.
I'm going to play devil's advocate here as we talk about this, because we constantly hear these arguments back and forth, certainly about does not deter the death penalty. And certainly there are numbers that would support that. But there are those who say that, simply put, we cannot continue to overload the prisons. We cannot continue to keep people alive for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. That costs taxpayer money, and that in itself is wrong.
You know, it does cost a lot of money, but it's actually cheaper to give someone life without parole than to go through the death penalty system. I mean, this is an incredibly long, lengthy appeals process that's automatic, that's mandated. And then you look at the initial trials, which are much more costly than life without parole trials. We could save an awful lot of money by just switching to life without parole.
But again, but I have to ask, because people will then ask you to justify that, because they say that keeping a prisoner alive for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, having to house them, having to feed them, having to care for them, the medical care that's involved, that in itself is more expensive.
Oh, that's incorrect. And you can look at the study done by Duke University in North Carolina. You can look at the study in Maryland. They show it's vastly more expensive to execute somebody, even including the medical costs.
There is a rather interesting soundbite here from Jim Willett. He is the former warden at the Huntsville Walls, and he tells reporters, and I want you to hear this too, our audience to hear this, that despite having supervised more executions than any other warden in the United States, he still has his misgivings. Listen to this.
I kind of went there on the fence about whether executions were right or wrong, and I left there the same way. I kind of always felt like I was a cog in a pretty good sized wheel. I always thought, well, the executioner has the one that's really hard, but then on the other end, so do those jurists. Those people on the jury I wouldn't want to do their job.
Would you think that there's a lot of people who are in a position of authority in law enforcement, such as those are wardens at prisons, who feel as he does?
I work with several wardens, or I have had the pleasure of doing so, and many of them have problems with the death penalty. It's actually pretty harmful on many departments or Department of Corrections employees. They actually become friends with many of these people, and then they have to put them to death, and they find it very harmful, and some of them actually suffer from PTSD.
What is the deterrent then? And I think that this is what America wants to understand here, because it seems as if we have more violent crime than ever before, certainly more shootings than ever before. We have more planned out killings. And there are people out there who will say that these are the people who deserve death. So where do we go from there, and what is the answer then?
Well, I think for me personally, it's much easier than that. It's just switch to a system of life without parole so we can save the taxpayers' money. We don't run the risk of killing innocent people, and we can stay true to our principles, because we've seen the current system is utterly broken in nearly every way. And moving forward and trying to make it work has proven to be unfeasible.
Okay, so let's get to that point. Let's move on from there. How do we then get to that point, if indeed we want to go to that life without parole? There are a tremendous amount of steps that have to be taken here. Plus, you understand there is going to be a tremendous amount of opposition to an idea such as that.
Well, of course there is, but we've seen 6 states in 7 years have repealed the death penalty because they found after years of trying to make it work properly that it was irrevocably broken. So many states are already taking the lead, and we saw New Hampshire was working towards that, Nebraska, Kansas, and many other red states are working towards that because they see that this is a program that's inconsistent with conservatives' core principles.
Well, see, now there's something else, and I will tell you that this comes from a lot of personal conversations. There are those, and observations as well. There are those, many people who believe that conservatives are the ones who want the death penalty, that they are, and I will be very frank here, some people say that conservatives are bloodthirsty. That's all they want. They want to get in there, they want revenge, and they want this taken care of. That is a perception that is out there right now. Is it not fair to say that you've got to fight that perception in a lot of areas?
Well, there's a myth that we're trying to shatter, that all conservatives support the death penalty, and I'm definitely a conservative, and many others that work with us, like Jay Sekulow and Richard Viguerie, oppose the death penalty, and they're conservatives. I don't accept that bloodthirsty statement, but I think conservatives want to have strict and rigid justice. And for a while, we believed, especially in the 90s, that we could implement that sort of justice through the death penalty. But we're learning that we can't trust the government with this kind of power.
Where does that come from then? Now, we've just talked about perception here, and I will tell you that that is a widespread perception. In your opinion then, and in your experience, where does that come from?
I think that's just built out of a mindset that came from the 80s and 90s, and there's some residual effects from that, and I believe that's why it's still here.
Let's talk about humane treatment then, because that certainly is always a part of the death penalty argument. There are those who will say, quite frankly, that when you use pentobarbital, you use some form of drugs here, that it is more humane than anything else. Your response?
Well, that kind of speaks to an Eighth Amendment issue of cruel and unusual punishment, which that may speak to some conservatives. I'm not one of them. My issue leans more towards the physical and the pro-life, the moral aspects of it. The cruel punishment, that's kind of subjective. So that depends on the individual whether or not they consider it cruel.
Is the moral aspect pretty big in this? Because we always get down to those who believe that a life is a life, and a life is precious, no matter what it is. So is that possibly one of the biggest issues here that has to be taken into account, that the moral is more important than anything else?
It is, and we're seeing a lot of pro-life individuals coming out against the death penalty, whether it's Catholics that have a consistent life ethic from conception to natural death, or those that just support or say that they're so-called pro-innocent life. But we run the risk of killing innocent life. So regardless of which philosophy you subscribe to, the death penalty is inconsistent with that.
It is always interesting to have this debate, because there's always, every time that I have this, and I talk to many people around the country, there are those people who have been affected by very serious crime, very violent crime. Many times they're families. And the families often are the ones who say beyond, well, in my experience, many times, I want justice. And to them, justice is an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and that means an execution. How do you convince these people that it's the wrong way to think?
Well, I work closely with many murder victims' family members, and the current system of capital punishment is incredibly harmful. And many of them that I work with, they don't oppose the death penalty theoretically. They oppose the current system of capital punishment because it promises them a death sentence. That promise is not always kept. and then they're re-traumatized through a decades-long process of trials and appeals. And in the end, if they do actually execute the offender, it's the offender that becomes a household name, while the victim's generally forgotten.
I think it is those trials and appeals that has quite a lot of people always thinking about getting it over with as quickly as possible. Marc, thank you so much for taking a couple of minutes to join us. I have a feeling we will be here again and discuss this.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It is now a very simple question for the audience here, because death penalty or not, you've now heard some of the arguments against it, and perhaps just go to life without parole. Tell us what you think now on social media, and we will answer those questions here. Get to us on Twitter, on email, or on Facebook. Let us know what you think. This is the Newsmax TV network, news for an intelligent audience, and MidPoint, where every day we question everything.